So I want to just start by saying I'm so happy to be speaking to this group, but I am particularly thrilled that there are so many students in the audience. Students are some of my, it's one, particularly all of you are high school students? Yeah. Say again, what? Some university. Anyway, I'm thrilled. I'm really, really excited to be talking to everybody. But it was such a thrill to see how many students came in. So, as Melvin explained, I am an historian, a particular kind of historian, an historian of science and medicine. But I'm not a scientist. I'm not a doctor. And nor am I a practitioner of a contemplative practice. But as an historian, I want to share with you one of the craziest things I've learned. The world we live in didn't have to end up this way. The assumptions that we take for granted, they weren't always assumed by people in the past. They had to get forged and made and fought for us to take them now for granted today. Our beliefs about who we should talk to, what we should find interesting. Of course, in some sense, they're ours, but often we're drawn to them because we live in spaces that have been shaped by choices that other people in the past have made for us. People who have made their own choices, have their own stories, but whose choices and stories we usually have forgotten or never knew, but the legacies of which still shape our lives. So I want to kind of make the argument that in spite of what a lot of you probably thought or learned about history when you took it in school, or maybe are still taking it, history is not just about the past. It's about understanding and engaging more effectively with projects in our present moment, because this present moment is not given to us, it's made. So here's a little plea, it matters. Now, it was mentioned, Melvin mentioned that as an historian, I'm in the early stages of trying to think about how I can apply this way of thinking to one of the biggest projects in science, us, our consciousness, our awareness, the things that make us fundamentally human. And the way I've been thinking through this project is by doing what I often like to do when I'm starting a new project. I've been teaching about it. I've been gathering students into a classroom, and we've been trying to figure things out together. And the argument that I've been trying to persuade my students of is that there isn't, you might think there's this scientific quest to understand consciousness. There isn't a single quest. There isn't a single conversation. There are many conversations. There are many quests. Each of them have their own history, their own logic, and only some of them end up connecting up with one another. And to understand why there are so many conversations, I've been trying to also persuade my students of a different point: the power and importance of place. Places, spaces, both literal spaces and also imaginary spaces, spaces of our imagination, profoundly shape the kinds of conversations we tend to have and the kinds of projects that we consider important. So, for example, conversations about consciousness look one way when you're in an ICU and family members are begging the doctors to tell them whether that beloved family member who is in a coma, is he still there? Is there someone still inside? Is there someone still at home? And will they ever come back? That's a certain kind of conversation about consciousness. There's a very different kind of conversation that you might have if you go to, say, a sleep lab, and people start asking questions about dreaming And what kind of a conscious state is it? It's not like our ordinary consciousness, but it's not the same as being unconscious. What is it? Or when you go into a hospice and you bear witness to the experiences of a dying person who is maybe having deathbed visions. Or you're swimming underwater with octopi. Nervous systems radically different from our own, but who seem profoundly aware. Or maybe you're hanging out in a tech workspace like Google, and you're having a conversation with a chatbot, and you're disconcerted by how apparently aware the chatbot seems to be. So these are the kinds of things I've been doing in this class, and in this class, my students and I get curious about two things. First, how each of these spaces that enable these different kinds of conversations got made, and how they function in our own time. And this takes me to this space, because we're in a space too, and our moment. So here I'm on a panel with an old friend of mine named Cliff, and a new friend of mine named Galen. Cliff is a neuroscientist. Galen is a Buddhist spiritual practitioner. And I want to be curious about this, like, why Buddhism? Why neuroscience? Why not other spiritual traditions, other scientific traditions? Why bring them together? Why not just stick to one or stick to the other? And asking these questions doesn't mean that I or anyone is questioning that Buddhism has rich, interesting things to say about consciousness. It doesn't mean that neuroscience isn't a brilliant branch of science that has a lot to teach us about the mind. All that means is that because we know from history that every space, every conversation in every space is made and is therefore constrained by certain assumptions, that there's interest and also power in trying to understand how they get made and why they look the way they do. So what would be interesting for us to know about this space? Well, historians like to tell stories, and I'm going to therefore try to give you an answer by telling you briefly a little story about something that took place more than a century ago. In 1893, and it's also a story that I am wagering is familiar to at least some of you who are regular participants in the Festival of Faiths, because it's one of its most important predecessors. It might be what you would consider like the original Festival of Faiths. It took place in Chicago, and it was called the World Parliament of Religions. And basically, for 17 days, representatives from faith traditions from the West and the East interacted, explained themselves to one another. They forged new kinds of friendships, new forms of understanding. Basically, they actually helped to launch, this event helped to launch the interfaith movement of which all of us are beneficiaries today. But this event, I think I have a kind of, let me see if I can, yeah, I can, somewhere there's a, oh, there we go. This event, I just want to like gesture. This event also left another legacy that may be less well known than the one I just outlined, because it was at this meeting that we first see Buddhist spiritual leaders, people who had come from places like Japan and Sri Lanka, arguing that Buddhism brought a special virtue to the table. Its approaches to spiritual life, its claims about reality, they said, were deeply compatible with the claims of modern Western science. And there's something you need to know. Let me just show you this is sort of what some of the people who are making these arguments, here are some of the folks at this meeting. And there is something you need to know about what they were doing when they made this argument. Because it isn't that the version of Buddhism that they presented was not authentic, but it is the case that it was of a very definite reformist and modern kind. It was an understanding of Buddhism that downplayed ritual and text and emphasized instead experience and inquiry, and there was definitely a politics at play in their decision to insist on the compatibility of their tradition with that of Western science. Because they'd come to Chicago in 1893 in a time when modernist forces back home and colonialist forces back home were putting their spiritual traditions at risk. And so insisting now on the compatibility of those traditions with modern science was a way to both fight for their relevance back home and to win new supporters abroad. The strategy worked. At least it worked for the audience in Chicago, and it worked for another really important reason, because it was made against a background understanding of the time that Christianity, which is the dominant Western religious tradition, was actually having a hard time with science. In particular, it was having a hard time reconciling biblical understandings of human nature and human origins with new understandings like you're seeing here. Oops, hang on. There it is. Of Darwinian evolutionary theory, arguing that we, in fact, evolved from lower life forms. And so the view around Christianity was that, in contrast to what these folks were saying about Buddhism, the Christian view and the scientific view were, at best, uneasy parallel worlds. At worst, they were in a state of open warfare. And here you see some of the classic writings at the time about this. But maybe Buddhism was different. And if so, maybe it offered a way to bring the science and the spiritual together. That was the claim made in 1893, and the big takeaway I want to just make clear is that the idea has had legs. It's had legs, but it hasn't had legs in the sense that there's been a kind of consistent story about Buddhism and science in dialogue. Instead, what you see is a lot of shifting understandings around what science we want to be in conversation with and what understanding of Buddhism we want to be in conversation with. So in the early years, a big focus was on Buddhism's alleged compatibility with exactly those parts of science that Christianity allegedly found most threatening. But in the 1940s and 50s, the focus shifted to Buddhism as a theory of mind, particularly, and then the science that was deemed most relevant to learning from Buddhism wasn't neuroscience. It was something no one even knows anything about anymore, psychoanalysis. This system associated with names like Sigmund Freud that was interested in freeing people from the tyranny of their unconscious minds. And here you see a very prominent teacher in the mid-20th century of Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, T.D. Suzuki, saying the concept of the unconscious is the foundation of Zen Buddhism. But then sometime in the 70s and 80s, meditation in the West became increasingly framed by new generations of teachers, not just as practices for achieving enlightenment, but as wellness practices that could assist in the goal of expanding human consciousness, stabilizing human consciousness, improving our capacity to flourish. And this set the stage. Oh, by the way, anyone on this first guy on the left, anyone over 40? Who is it? Yeah, so we don't have time to go into him, but he is a critically important figure in the reimagining of meditation into this space. And this sets the stage for our own moment that has identified brain science as a natural partner for a dialogue with Buddhism, and particularly has identified meditation as a focus for dialogue between these two traditions, in the hope that together these two traditions can help us better understand how to tame our unruly conscious minds, how to become more fully human. And we should be surprised about this, just a little bit, because in other spaces, not this one, neuroscience doesn't seem like it's a discipline that is particularly friendly to spiritual conversations. You're looking here at an article from 1997 by a journalist named Ton Wolfe, and the title says it all, "Sorry, but your soul just died." And you can see he goes on to say, "It's the great intellectual event of the late 20th century. New discoveries in neuroscience are challenging our established ideas about morality, free will, and human nature." So maybe neuroscience is really the field that's going to flatten our humanness and turn it into a bunch of meaningless chemical and electrical interactions. The fact that we're here, though, suggests there's a bigger and more complicated story, that there's been another cultural reframing to allow for dialogue to happen. There's a particularly, I'm just going to throw up one last slide, the dialogue within the Buddhist neuroscience space that's particularly tended over the years to focus on a form of Buddhism that previously had not actually played a big role in these conversations, Tibetan Buddhism. And a big reason I put this slide up is Cliff took the picture. And I'm hoping that we can talk a little bit about this space and how it's contributed to the events that have led to this panel. But charismatic individuals have mattered a lot in this space. D.T. Suzuki mattered a lot to the conversations in the 1950s. The Dalai Lama of Tibet has mattered a lot to the conversations in the 1990s and beyond. So where does this land us? I think back in where we began, but maybe with some new understandings that we understand that specific visions of dialogue between spiritual traditions and science are not given, they're made. We know that they've varied over time in ways that have reflected the preoccupations of different historical moments. We also know that the making of every dialogue requires work on both sides, requires translations, reframings, decisions to focus selectively on this rather than some other point of view, finding common ground while potentially avoiding other areas that might feel less compatible. And there's one last thing I'll say that I think we now understand, which is that the original decision to privilege Buddhism in this modern effort to bring science and spirituality together happened at a particular moment for a particular historical reason. It's been fruitful, but it doesn't mean that we have to be locked into a future that fails to be curious about other spiritual traditions, other world faiths that might, if they were asked to join the party, also have something to contribute to this conversation. And it seems to me that cultivating that final kind of curiosity is exactly what any kind of festival of faith should ask of us all. Thank you.